Shadows in silk suits, Harrison Wells stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, watching the San Francisco skyline glitter like fallen stars against the night. The city was beautiful from 70 floors up. From here, you couldn't see the chaos, the noise, the unrelenting pace that had hollowed him out over the years. "Mr. Wells, they're waiting for you in the conference room." His assistant's voice was perfectly modulated, professional. Everything in his life was professional now, curated, managed. "Tell them 5 minutes," Harrison replied, not turning around. He could feel her hesitation before she left. The acquisition meeting had already been delayed twice because of his schedule, and the board was growing impatient. Vanguard Technologies wasn't just another company to add to his portfolio. It was crucial for launching the new AI platform that would keep Wells' innovations ahead of their competitors. Harrison straightened his custom Italian tie and grabbed his tablet. The numbers were good. The team had prepared comprehensive reports. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He hated it. 30 minutes later, Harrison sat at the head of the gleaming conference table, half listening as lawyers discussed contract terms. The room was filled with expensive suits and calculated smiles. He caught fragments of conversation, market penetration, restructuring opportunities, aggressive growth targets. "What do you think, Harrison?" His CFO, Daniel Patterson, was looking at him expectantly. Harrison realized he'd missed something important. "Run the projections again," he said smoothly, buying time. "We already did." Daniel's smile tightened. "Twice!" The room fell silent. These people depended on him. His employees, the company's shareholders, even the founders of Vanguard who were selling their life's work to him. But lately, Harrison couldn't escape the feeling that he was just going through motions, playing a role that had been written for him long ago. "Let's take 10, he said, standing abruptly. In the privacy of his office, Harrison loosened his tie and pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. 42 years old, and what did he have to show for it? A fortune that kept growing, an empty apartment, and a calendar so full he needed 3 assistants to manage it. His phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca, the gallery owner he'd been casually seeing. "Dinner tomorrow? There's someone I want you to meet. Potential investor for the new exhibition." Even his personal life had become a networking opportunity. Harrison didn't reply. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He acted without a strategy. He called his pilot. "Get the jet ready, 1 hour." "Destination, sir?" "I don't care. Somewhere quiet, coastal. I'll be there in an hour." He sent a brief email to his executive team about an unexpected personal matter, packed a small bag with casual clothes he rarely wore, and left through the private elevator without telling anyone where he was going. By midnight, Harrison was flying over the Pacific Northwest, watching the cities give way to darkness, broken only by small clusters of lights. Below him, tiny towns dotted the coastline like fireflies. "Sir?" The pilot's voice came through the intercom. "We need to decide on a landing destination soon." Harrison studied the navigation screen, then pointed to a small regional airport near the Oregon coast. "There, what's the nearest town?" Shipwreck Cove, small fishing village turned tourist spot. Population about 3,000, perfect. No one would look for Harrison Wells there. For the first time in months, he felt something stir inside him, anticipation perhaps, or maybe just relief. As the jet began its descent, Harrison looked out at the vast darkness of the ocean meeting the shore. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be a CEO, he wouldn't be a billionaire. For a little while, he could just be a man with no meetings, no decisions, no expectations. Just a man, trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. Salt air and second chances. The morning light filtered through curtains that weren't his, in a room that smelled of cedar and sea salt. Harrison woke disoriented, before remembering his impulsive escape. He'd checked into the Driftwood Inn just after midnight. A quaint two-story building with weathered shingles and a sign that swung gently in the coastal breeze. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Edith, hadn't recognized him. She'd simply handed him a key attached to a carved wooden buoy and pointed him toward the stairs. Breakfasts from 7 to 10, coffee's always on. Harrison showered and dressed in jeans and a simple grey sweater, clothes he kept for the rare weekend at his Napa property. Without his usual suit of armor, he felt strangely vulnerable, almost like an imposter in his own skin. Outside, Shipwreck Cove unfolded before him. The main street curved alongside the harbour, where fishing boats bobbed in the morning tide. Small storefronts with hand-painted signs lined the road, not a chain store in sight. The air tasted of salt and possibility. Following the scent of coffee, Harrison found himself outside a weathered blue building with wide windows facing the ocean. A wooden sign hanging above the door read, "Horizon Line Cafe," in flowing script. Through the windows, he could see a cozy interior filled with mismatched furniture and locals engaged in morning conversation. The bell chimed softly as he entered. The cafe was warm and inviting, with bookshelves lining one wall and photographs of the ocean in various moods hanging on another. Behind the counter, a woman was laughing with an older fisherman as she poured his coffee. "Just a second," she called without looking up, her voice carrying a hint of huskiness, like someone who enjoyed a good laugh. Harrison found a small table by the window and sat down, watching the harbour come to life in the morning light. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to be, no calls to make, no decisions waiting for his approval. "What can I get you?" The woman from behind the counter now stood at his table, notepad in hand. Harrison looked up and felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way the women in his social circles were, but there was something arresting about her face. Her eyes were deep brown with flecks of gold, crinkled at the corners from smiling. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy knot, with strands escaping to frame her face. She wore no makeup that he could detect, and a camera hung around her neck. "Coffee," Harrison said, finding his voice. "And whatever breakfast you recommend." She studied him with an amused expression. "You're new here. Is it that obvious? It's a small town. I know everyone, and I definitely don't know you." She extended her hand. "Josephine Winters. Everyone calls me Joe." Harrison. He shook her hand, deliberately omitting his last name. "And yes, I just got in last night." "Business or pleasure?" Joe asked, writing down his order. "Neither," Harrison replied honestly. "Escape." Instead of the polite smile he expected, Joe laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the cafe. "Well, you've come to the right place. Shipwreck Cove specializes in fresh starts and hiding places." She nodded toward the ocean. "The sea has a way of washing things clean." "That's what I'm counting on," Harrison murmured. Joe returned minutes later with a steaming mug of coffee and a plate piled with what she called lighthouse breakfast, perfectly cooked eggs, sourdough toast, and local smoked salmon. As Harrison he found himself observing the easy way Joe moved through the cafe, greeting customers by name, refilling cups without being asked, laughing at familiar jokes. "So, what are you escaping from?" Joe asked bluntly when she returned to clear his plate. Harrison hesitated. "Work, expectations, a life that doesn't quite fit anymore." Joe nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "That's usually it, either running from something or someone." She glanced at his hand. "No ring, so probably not the latter." "And you?" Harrison found himself asking. "What's your story?" "Me?" Joe smiled, but Harrison noticed it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not running anymore." "This is where I stopped." Before he could respond, a crash came from the kitchen, followed by cursing. "Excuse me," Joe said, hurrying away. "Theo's at war with the dishwasher again." Harrison lingered over his coffee, watching as Joe disappeared into the kitchen. Through the serving window, he could see her helping an older man with a mop and gentle teasing. There was something about the scene that tugged at him, the easy camaraderie, the lack of pretense. When she returned, Harrison found himself asking, "Do you need an extra pair of hands?" Joe raised an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as someone who's done much dishwashing." "I haven't," Harrison admitted. "But I learned quickly." She studied him with those perceptive eyes, then shrugged. "The shelf under the counter collapsed this morning. If you're handy with tools, that would help more than dishes." Before he knew it, Harrison was kneeling behind the counter with a borrowed toolbox, repairing the wooden shelf. Nearby, Joe prepared coffee orders, occasionally glancing down at him. With bemused curiosity, "You're not bad at this," she commented when he finished. "I built my first computer when I was 12, Harrison said, standing and dusting off his hands. "Shelves aren't so different." "A tech guy, huh?" Joe looked interested. "Tourist or running away? Is there a third option? Finding something?" Joe suggested, turning to serve a customer. Harrison watched her move with easy confidence through her small domain, exchanging words with everyone who entered. He realized suddenly that in his real life, he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't in some way transactional. "Thank you for breakfast," Harrison said when the morning rush subsided, "and for letting me feel useful." "You're welcome back any time," Joe replied, meeting his eyes directly. "Especially if you're good with fixing things. This place is basically held together with hope and duct tape." As Harrison stepped outside, the sea breeze caught him full in the face. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no plans, no schedule, just a day stretching before him like an uncharted sea, and surprisingly, a desire to return to a blue cafe with mismatched chairs and a woman whose eyes saw too much. Tides of truth. 3 days had passed since Harrison first stumbled into Horizon Line Cafe. 3 days of mornings spent fixing various broken items around Joe's cafe, afternoons exploring the rugged coastline, and evenings sharing meals and stories. At the small corner table by the window, 3 days of being just Harrison, not Harrison Wells, tech magnate and one of the richest men in America. This morning, Joe had closed the cafe early, declaring that Harrison needed to see the tide, pools at Archer's Point before he left town. "Whenever that might be," she'd added with a sidelong glance that made his heart beat faster. They walked along the rocky shore, Joe occasionally stopping to photograph interesting formations or light patterns on the water. Harrison found himself watching her more than the scenery, the way she tilted her head when considering a shot, the small smile of satisfaction when she captured something perfectly. "So you were a professional photographer before opening the cafe?" Harrison asked, as they picked their way across the rocks. "Photojournalist," Joe corrected, crouching to examine a starfish. "I spent 10 years traveling to every conflict zone and natural disaster I could find." "What changed?" Joe straightened, her expression growing distant as she gazed out at the horizon. "I lost perspective, started chasing increasingly dangerous situations for more impactful shots." She touched the thin scar that ran along her jawline, which Harrison had noticed but never mentioned. "A bombing in Kyiv 4 years ago made me realize I was using the camera to avoid actually living my life." Harrison nodded, understanding more than he could say. "So, you came here?" "My grandfather left me the building. It was a bait shop then." Joe smiled at the memory. "I'd spent summers here as a kid. It felt like the universe was offering a path out." They reached the tide pools, small worlds teeming with life, revealed only when the tide retreated. Joe knelt beside one, pointing out tiny crabs and sea anemones to Harrison with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved secret. "Your turn," Joe said as they sat on a large driftwood log, sharing a thermos of coffee she'd brought. 3 days of fixing things in my cafe, and you've managed to tell me almost nothing about yourself." Harrison tensed slightly. Not much to tell. Joe gave him a skeptical look. Let's see. You're clearly successful enough to drop everything and fly to a random coastal town. You wear what looks like a very expensive watch that you keep trying to hide under your sleeve. You're comfortable giving orders, but not taking them, and you fix things with the precision of someone who understands how systems work. She took a sip of coffee. I'm guessing tech industry, high up the ladder. Harrison couldn't help but smile. Observant. Journalist, remember? So what is it? Startup founder, corporate executive. The moment hung between them, and Harrison found himself at a crossroads. The truth would change everything. The lie would preserve what they'd begun. To build. He chose a careful middle ground. I founded a tech company in San Francisco. It's grown bigger than I ever expected. Joe nodded, seeming satisfied with this partial truth. And now you're having a midlife crisis in my cafe? Harrison laughed, the sound surprising him. Something like that. As they walked back toward town, their hands occasionally brushed against each other. Harrison felt like a teenager again, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. Want to come over for dinner tonight? Joe asked as they reached the cafe. My place is just upstairs, nothing fancy, but I make a decent pasta. The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. I'd like that, Harrison replied softly. That evening, in Joe's apartment above the cafe, a warm space filled with books, photographs, and mementos from her travels, Harrison felt more at peace than he had in years. They cooked together, moving around her small kitchen with surprising ease, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Over dinner and wine, their conversation flowed effortlessly from books to travel to their shared love of the ocean. Joe told stories of photographing glaciers in Patagonia and sunrises over the Serengeti. Harrison found himself sharing memories of coding his first program as a child, of the thrill when his initial startup received its first investment. You still haven't told me the name of your company, Joe noted as they stood side by side washing dishes. Harrison hesitated. Does it matter? Joe studied him for a long moment. I suppose not. Not here anyway. Later, as they stood on her small balcony overlooking the darkened harbor, Harrison felt a sense of inevitability as Joe turned toward him. When their lips met, it wasn't the calculated kiss of his previous relationships. It was honest, questioning, alive with possibility. Stay, Joe whispered against his mouth, and Harrison did. The next morning, Harrison woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and Joe's warm presence beside him. For a few precious minutes, he allowed himself to imagine a different life. Mornings like this, days filled with meaningful work and genuine connection, evenings with someone who saw him, not his wealth or power. Coffee? Joe murmured, stirring. Beside him. I'll get it, Harrison offered, pulling on his jeans. In Joe's living room, he noticed a stack of mail on her coffee table. As he moved toward the kitchen, his eye caught a familiar image on a folded newspaper. His own face, staring back at him from the business section. Harrison froze. The headline read, Wells Innovations CEO's mysterious disappearance raises questions on Wall Street. The article detailed speculation about his sudden absence during crucial acquisition negotiations, with quotes from concerned board members and dips in stock prices. A sidebar highlighted his estimated net worth, $8.7 billion, and the empire he'd built. Harrison? Joe's voice came from the bedroom doorway. Everything okay? He turned slowly, the newspaper in his hand, and watched as recognition dawned in her eyes. Harrison Wells, she said flatly, no question in her voice. Joe, I can explain. Billionaire CEO Harrison Wells. Joe's expression hardened. Not just some tech guy having a midlife crisis. That part was true, Harrison said quietly. The crisis, at least. Joe crossed her arms. Were you ever going to tell me? Yes. No. I don't know. Harrison ran a hand through his hair. Everything here felt real in a way nothing has for years. I didn't want to lose that. By lying about who you are, by being seen for who I am, not what I own. Jo shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping. God, the irony. I spent years documenting people's truths, and I couldn't even see the deception right in front of me. It wasn't deception. What would you call it? Jo's voice rose slightly. A week of pretending to be someone you're not? Testing out the simple life like it's some kind of vacation experience? Harrison saw hurt beneath her anger, and it cut deeper than he expected. That's not what this was. Then what was it, Harrison? Jo's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What exactly did you think would happen here? The truth was, he hadn't thought beyond each day, each moment with her. The future had remained deliberately unexamined. I think you should go, Jo said into his silence, turning away. Harrison wanted to argue, to explain the suffocation of his real life, the unexpected freedom he'd found in her cafe, the connection that had nothing to do with his wealth or status. But the hurt in her eyes stopped him. Jo, please. Her voice was steady now, controlled. I need you to leave. As Harrison walked back to the inn through the morning mist, the weight of his real life settled back onto his shoulders. His phone, which he'd barely checked in days, showed dozens of missed calls and messages. Reality was reclaiming him. But as he packed his bag, Harrison realized with startling clarity that he didn't want to go back to his old life. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do next. Storms and shelter. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Harrison sat on the weathered bench overlooking the harbor. The changing weather mirrored his turbulent thoughts. His jet waited at the regional airport. His executive team was in crisis. Mode and Wall Street analysts were speculating about his company's future. The rational choice, the only choice really, was to return to San Francisco immediately. Yet here he sat, watching fishing boats rock in the strengthening wind, unable to leave Shipwreck Cove, unable to leave Jo. His phone rang again. Daniel, his CFO, for the 5th time today. Harrison finally answered. Where the hell are you? Daniel's voice crackled with tension. The Vanguard deal is falling apart. Their board is getting nervous about your absence, and our stock has dropped 12%. We need you back. I know, Harrison replied, watching seagulls struggle against the wind. I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow? Harrison, we have an emergency board meeting in 3 hours. Handle it, Daniel. You know what to say. Harrison's voice was calm but firm. Tell them I've been dealing with a personal matter, but I'm fully committed to the acquisition. The terms remain as discussed. This isn't like you, Daniel said, confusion evident in his tone. Maybe that's the problem, Harrison replied before ending the call. The first raindrops fell as he walked toward Horizon Line Cafe. He hadn't planned to go there. His feet simply carried him along the familiar path. Through the window, he could see Jo moving about, her face set in a determined expression as she served customers. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met through the glass. Harrison watched her stiffen, her hands tightening around the coffee pot. For a moment, he thought she might come outside, but instead, she turned deliberately, away. The local weather radio was broadcasting storm warnings as Harrison returned to the Driftwood Inn. Edith was placing sandbags by the door, muttering about high tide and storm surges. Nasty one coming, she told him. They're saying it could be the worst in years. You might want to head out before the roads flood. I'll take my chances, Harrison replied, helping her with a particularly heavy bag. By evening, the storm had intensified. Rain lashed against Harrison's window as he sat in his room, laptop open, attempting to address the most critical issues at Wells Innovations remotely. The internet connection sputtered and failed as thunder cracked overhead. Harrison, closed his laptop with a sigh. His mind wasn't on quarterly projections or acquisition strategies. It was downstairs in a blue cafe with a woman whose honest eyes had seen beyond his wealth to something he'd almost forgotten existed. A sharp knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, Edith stood there, rain-soaked and frantic. The cafe, Joe's place. The creek behind it is flooding. Water's coming in fast. Everyone's helping with sandbags, but Harrison didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed his jacket and followed her into the storm. The scene at Horizon Line was chaotic. The creek that normally trickled peacefully behind the building had swollen into a raging torrent, water already seeping under the back door. Locals formed a chain, passing sandbags from a pickup truck to create a barrier. And there was Joe, soaked to the skin, directing operations with the same efficiency she showed running her cafe. When she spotted Harrison, her expression flickered between surprise, relief, and wariness. "I didn't think this was your kind of crisis," she said as he approached. "You'd be surprised what I'm good at," Harrison replied, rolling up his sleeves. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in the driving rain, speaking only when necessary, united by the immediate threat. Harrison organized the volunteers into a more efficient system, his executive experience translating surprisingly well to emergency management. When the sandbag wall was complete, Joe unlocked the cafe's front door. "Everyone inside," she called over the howling wind. "Coffee's on me tonight." The cafe became an impromptu storm shelter, filled with wet, exhausted townspeople sharing storm stories and checking weather updates on phones with spotty service. Harrison found himself at the counter beside Joe, making sandwiches for hungry volunteers. "Thank you," Joe said quietly as they worked. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," Harrison replied simply. Joe studied him for a moment before turning to distribute the food. The cafe lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving them in darkness broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. Someone produced candles, and soon the space was filled with a warm, golden glow. As the evening wore on, most volunteers left during a lull in the storm to check on their own homes. Eventually, only Harrison and Joe remained, sitting at opposite ends of the counter in candlelight, the rain still drumming against the windows. "Your company must be in chaos," Joe finally said, breaking the silence between them. "It is," Harrison acknowledged. "Yet you're still here." "I am." Joe traced the wood grain of the counter with her finger. "Why?" Harrison considered his words carefully. "Because for the first time in years, I'm making decisions as a person, not as a CEO. Because helping you save this cafe matters more to me right now than a billion-dollar acquisition." Joe looked up, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "This isn't some romantic movie, Harrison. You can't just walk away from your life." "I'm not walking away," Harrison said. "I'm trying to figure out how to live it differently. And where do I fit into this epiphany?" Joe's voice held a hint of bitterness. "Am I the charming local character who helped the billionaire find himself?" "You're the woman who saw me," Harrison said simply. "Not my money, not my company, me." Joe's laugh was soft and sad. "I didn't even know who you were." "Exactly." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows. Joe stood, pacing nervously. "The creek's probably rising. Again. I should check the back." Harrison followed her through the darkened cafe to the storage room. Water was seeping under the door, despite the sandbags, slowly spreading across the floor. "It's coming in faster," Joe said, grabbing towels to stem the flow. "If it breaches the main cafe area, I'll lose everything." As they worked frantically to contain the water, Joe suddenly stopped, a look of defeat crossing her face. "This is pointless. Nature always wins." Harrison straightened, looking directly at her. "Tell me what this place means to you." "What?" "The cafe. What does it mean to you?" Joe hesitated, then answered with unexpected rawness. Safety. The first place that felt like mine after years of running. A second chance. She ran a hand along the wall. My grandfather built this place, said it was meant to be a lighthouse for lost souls. Harrison nodded. Then we fight for it. He pulled out his phone. No service. Is there a landline? Joe nodded, leading him to the office. Harrison made 3 calls, the first to a construction company in Portland, the second to an emergency restoration service, the third to his assistant in San Francisco. What are you doing? Joe asked when he hung up. Solving problems. It's what I do. Harrison turned to face her. I crossed a line by not telling you who I was. I apologize for that, but I'm not sorry for anything else that happened between us. Joe's expression softened slightly. Neither am I. They stood in silence, the storm raging outside, the water slowly advancing across the floor. I have resources, Harrison said carefully. Let me help save your cafe. No strings attached. And then what? Joe asked, her voice barely audible. Above the storm. Then... Harrison stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes by candlelight. Then I go back to San Francisco, handle what needs handling, and figure out how to be the man I was here while still being who I need to be there. And us? Harrison reached out, hesitantly touching her cheek. That depends on whether you can forgive me and whether you're willing to try something complicated. I don't do complicated, Joe said, but she didn't move away from his touch. Neither did I, Harrison replied with a small smile, until I walked into your cafe. Outside, the wind howled and the rain fell in sheets, but in the darkened office of Horizon Line Cafe, something fragile and new began to take root. A possibility neither of them had anticipated, as unpredictable as the storm itself. I'm still angry, Joe whispered, her hand coming up to cover his. I know. And I don't trust easily. I know that too. Joe looked up at him, vulnerability and strength mingled in her gaze. But I'm willing to try, not for Harrison Wells, billionaire, for Harrison, the guy who fixed my shelves and faced down a storm. As if in response, the lights flickered back on, illuminating them standing close together, hands intertwined. Looks like the power's back, Joe said softly. In more ways than one, Harrison replied, and pulled her closer as the storm raged on. Horizons unbound. 3 months later, Harrison stood at the window of his San Francisco penthouse, watching the city lights glimmer against the night sky. The view was the same, but the man observing it had fundamentally changed. Mr. Wells, your car is waiting. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Thank you, Claire, Harrison replied, adjusting his tie. Not an Italian silk today, but a hand-woven blue one Joe had given him. The exact color of the ocean at sunrise. She'd said the board meeting had gone better than expected. His proposal to restructure Wells Innovations' leadership had passed with minimal resistance. After all, the company's stock had rebounded remarkably once he returned from his sabbatical, and the Vanguard acquisition had ultimately succeeded, albeit with some renegotiated terms. What the board didn't yet know was that this was just the beginning of the changes Harrison planned to implement. Downstairs, his driver held the car door open. The airport, sir? Harrison nodded, checking his watch, a simple leather-banded timepiece that had replaced his custom Patek Philippe. The private terminal, and I'll need to be back Monday morning for the foundation meeting. As the car glided through evening traffic, Harrison reviewed the documents his team had prepared for the Wells Foundation's new initiative, bringing technology, education, and resources to underserved coastal communities. The pilot program would launch in Shipwreck Cove next month. Harrison smiled, thinking of Joe's reaction when he'd first proposed the idea. I don't need your charity, she'd said immediately, that familiar spark of independence flashing in her. It's not charity, he'd explained. It's community investment, and selfishly it gives me a legitimate business reason to be there regularly. The past 3 months had been a careful dance of rebuilding trust and creating a new kind of relationship, one that honored both their worlds. Harrison had returned to San Francisco as promised, diving back into the work that, despite everything, still challenged and fulfilled him. But he'd also restructured his schedule, delegated more responsibility, and set clear boundaries that his team now respected. Every Friday afternoon, he boarded his jet to Oregon. Every Monday morning, he returned to California. In between, he was simply Harrison, the man who helped in Joe's cafe during the busy breakfast rush, who was learning to sail in the cove's choppy waters, who slept peacefully with Joe in his arms in the apartment above horizon line. The arrangement wasn't perfect. There were difficult phone calls, lonely nights, and moments of doubt on both sides. The distance tested them, as did the inevitable culture clash when Joe visited San Francisco for the first time and found herself thrust into Harrison's world of galas and business dinners. "I felt like an imposter," she'd confessed afterward. Everyone watching, wondering what the billionaire was doing with the small-town cafe owner. They were wondering how the billionaire got lucky enough to find someone real in a world of pretense. Harrison had corrected her. Now, as his plane lifted off into the night sky, Harrison felt the familiar anticipation that came with heading to Shipwreck Cove. His phone buzzed with a message from Joe, a photo of the cafe's newly renovated back room, a space that had been converted into a community technology center, where local students could access computers and take coding classes taught by Wells Innovation staff who volunteered remotely. Final touches complete. Edith's grandson already asking when he can learn to build a website, Joe's message read. Harrison smiled, typing back, "Tell him I'll help him start one this weekend." The storm had ultimately been a blessing in disguise. The flood damage had necessitated renovations, giving Harrison and Joe a project to focus on while navigating the complexities of their relationship. Working side by side to rebuild the cafe had created a foundation of shared purpose that helped bridge their different worlds. The plane landed at the small regional airport just after midnight. Joe was waiting in her weathered blue pickup truck, hair tousled by the sea breeze, looking nothing like the women Harrison had dated in his previous life. "Welcome back," she said as he slid into the passenger seat. Her kiss tasted of coffee and promise. "Good to be back," Harrison replied, meaning it more than she knew. As they drove along the coastal road toward town, Joe updated him on local happenings, the fishing tournament planned for next month, Theo's ongoing battle with the cafes, temperamental espresso machine, the community council's debate about expanding the harbor. "Oh, and a reporter from the Portland Tribune called," Joe added, shooting him a sideways glance. "Apparently, there's interest in the mysterious billionaire who's investing in small coastal towns." Harrison groaned. "What did you tell them?" That Harrison Wells wasn't available for comment, but they were welcome to come try our award-winning glam chowder. Joe grinned, though fair warning, a tech blog also reached out. "I think our cover might be blown." "It was bound to happen eventually," Harrison said philosophically. "Does it bother you?" Joe considered this as she turned onto the street above the harbor. "It did at first, the idea of becoming some footnote in your biography. But now?" She shrugged. "Let them talk. We know what's real." They parked behind the cafe and climbed the stairs to Joe's apartment. Inside, Harrison noted the subtle changes that had occurred over the past months. His books now intermingled with hers on the shelves, a high-end coffee maker, his one insistence on the counter, a framed photograph of them on the ferry to Vancouver Island. "Hungry?" Joe asked, opening the refrigerator. "I made that pasta you like." Harrison came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Later," he murmured against her neck. Much later, they sat on Joe's small balcony wrapped in blankets. sharing reheated pasta as the first hints of dawn brightened the eastern sky. Below them, the harbour was quiet, fishing boats waiting patiently for the morning tide. "I have news," Jo said, setting down her plate. "Remember Elena, the photo editor from National Geographic who came through last month?" Harrison nodded. Elena had been one of Jo's colleagues from her photojournalist days. She offered me an assignment, 3 weeks documenting coastal conservation efforts along the Pacific Northwest. Jo's eyes held a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. It would mean leaving the cafe in Theo's hands temporarily. "You should take it," Harrison said without hesitation. "If you want to." "You think so?" "Jo, your photography is extraordinary. The world should see it." He took her hand. "And Theo's been wanting more responsibility. It's perfect timing." Jo studied him. What happened to the man who couldn't delegate making coffee, let alone running his company? Harrison laughed. He met a stubborn cafe owner who taught him that. Control is an illusion, and trust is a choice. Wise woman. The wisest. Harrison's tone grew serious. "Take the assignment, Jo. I'll help Theo manage things while you're gone. Between the cafe and the tech center launch, I'll have plenty to keep me busy." Jo leaned against him, watching the horizon lighten. "I've been thinking about something else too," she said carefully. What if I spent more time in San Francisco?" Harrison went still. "You hate San Francisco." "I hate feeling out of place there," Jo corrected, "but maybe that's because I've been treating it as your world rather than part of our life." She turned to face him. "I could bring my camera. The Bay has stories waiting to be told too." "Are you sure?" Harrison searched her face. "I don't want you to feel you have to change for me." "I'm not changing," Jo said firmly. "I'm expanding, just like you have." She gestured toward the harbour. "Shipwreck Cove will always be home, but maybe we can have more than one home." The sun broke over the horizon then, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and golds. Harrison was reminded of their first morning together, how the light had illuminated Jo's face as she laughed with her customers, how something had shifted inside him at the sight. "I have something for you," Harrison said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Jo's eyes widened. "Harrison, it's not a ring," he said quickly, opening the box to reveal a delicate silver compass pendant. "Not yet, anyway. That's a conversation for another day." Jo lifted the compass, its face gleaming in the morning light. "When I first came to Shipwreck Cove, I was lost," Harrison explained. "You helped me find my direction again." He took the necklace and fastened it around her neck. "No matter where we go from here, San Francisco, your photography assignments, wherever this journey takes us, this is a reminder that we found each other when we weren't even looking." Jo touched the compass, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was watching a documentary last night about how sailors navigated before modern technology," she said softly. "They used the stars, the sun, the constant points on the horizon. And now we have GPS and satellite navigation." Jo smiled. "But the stars are still there, guiding us home." Harrison looked out at the ocean stretching endlessly before them, then back at Jo, the woman who had seen him when he was invisible even to himself. "I used to think home was a place," he said. "Now I know better." "What happens next?" Jo asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Harrison smiled.